In order to try and get a handle on this idea of race and racism, we're going to have to look at some definitions. So we're going to look at the definitions in several editions of the most prominent American English dictionary, editions going from 1919 up until 2006. So we're going to start in 1919. Definition of race. There is no definition for racism in this dictionary in 1919. That ought to tell you something. So we're going to look at the first definition. The descendants of the same ancestor, a family, tribe, people, or nation, taken as of the same stock. A lineage, a breed, also a class of individuals with common characteristics, interests, or the like. And so it's very important to note how the people who are writing this dictionary in 1919 are linking this in the same definition. The same definition includes the concepts of common descent, common characteristics, and interests. So we understand that from common descent come our common characteristics, and therefore come our interests. Very simple, very straightforward. And probably everybody would have believed this, whether you were on the left, the right, or in the middle. It just would have been apparent to everyone. 1941. Now, obviously, there was a big change in the world and world politics and world culture between those two times, and that was due to the ideology of a certain prominent and rather infamous Central European regime. So we'll see how it changed. We'll see what changed. Race, 1, the definition, the descendants of a common ancestor, family, tribe, people, or nation, believed to belong to the same stock. Let's go back. Taken as, believed. That's a noteworthy change. Could just be common usage, but now we're pushing the concept out of tradition into belief, which changes. It's a changeable notion. Also a class or kind of individuals with common characteristics, habits, or the like, as the race of doctors. So now we have pretty clearly, I think, moved this first definition away from common descent into unemployment and also belief. So this is, it's still, the definition's mostly the same, but you can see these subtle changes that were made. Now on the right-hand side here, you can see that we've added these definitions that weren't in the previous edition. Race riot, a riot animated by racial hatred, specifically U.S., conflict between whites and Negroes. Race suicide, this is a very interesting thing very interesting to find it here, but this was circulating at the time. The gradual extinction of a race through the voluntary failure of its members to keep the birth rate as high as the death rate. Now, this was important because there were some European nations, like France, which early started to experience this problem. Their birth rate was low. They had, I don't know how many million men killed in World War I, but that became a serious problem for them, and they could see that their population was not even going to stay stable. It was going to continue to drop. And so this notion was becoming prominent, and it made it into the dictionary. Imagine that. Racial, of race or a race, and then racialism, race prejudice, race hatred. Okay, so this is, you got race riot and racialism. We're already getting the concept of hatred in here by looking at distinctions between postulated races. Okay, 1953. Race, number 1, the descendants of a common ancestor, family, tribe, or nation, believed. Okay, and then race of doctors. So we've got the same definition from 1941 being carried forward. And then we've got racialism and racism. Racialism is race prejudice, expressing either favorable or unfavorable bias, especially race hatred. Racism, assumption of inherent racial superiority or the purity and superiority of certain races, and consequent discrimination against other races. Also, any doctrine or program of racial domination and discrimination based on such an assumption. Also, less specific, race hatred and discrimination. So here you can see already by 1953 that we had converged on the current understanding of what racism is. It's not so much, well, I guess it has changed a bit. So today it's more about prejudice. This definition is basically the caricature of the certain political regime that existed in Central Europe in the 1930s and 40s. That is what the definition, what people thought that was, has been moved over into this definition of racism. 1963. Race, number 1, a breeding stock of animals. Interesting. So now the number 1 definition of race has changed from being common descent in humans to being a breeding stock of animals. Number 2, a family, tribe, people, or nation belonging to the same stock. A class or kind of individuals with common characteristics or habits. That's it. So we lost some stuff here. 1963, racism, a belief that race is the primary determinant of human traits and capacities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. Look how drastic this change was here. In 1953, racism was a doctrine of purity and superiority of certain races that carried with it a consequent political doctrine of racial domination and discrimination. Whereas here in 1963, racism is a belief that race is a primary determinant of human characteristics and capacities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. Now, the first part of this, up to the point where it says produce an inherent superiority of a particular race, probably many people would have believed that even up to 1963 without believing in the second doctrine of superiority. They would have simply believed that Italians are Italians, that Germans are Germans, that Englishmen are Englishmen, that American Negroes are American Negroes, and everybody is going to fulfill within pretty wide boundaries some aspects of their racial type. But that belief has now become racism, which is linked to the caricature from the 1940s Allied propaganda of the certain political regime. Now, 1977, 1, a breeding stock of animals, so we've moved the humans out of it, just like last time. And then over here on the right, racial, okay, of or relating to based on a race or occurring between races. Just a minute, I'll be right back. Okay, let's see. Racialism is racial prejudice or discrimination. And then racism is a belief that race is the primary determinant of human characteristics and traits, and that racial differences produce inherent superiority of a particular race. So it's the same as last time. From 1963 to 1977, there's no change. 1983, race, a breeding stock of animals. 2, a family, tribe, or people or nation belonging to the same stock. A class or kind of people unified by community of interests, habits, or characteristics, the English. So the change here is that now in the second usage, there is no common descent implied, because as we know, the English themselves are an amalgam of many different groups, but for whatever reason they have some common interests, habits, or characteristics, and therefore they constitute the English race. So there's a little bit of back and forth here, but it's not too much change from the previous time. 1983, racism, a belief that race is the primary determinant of human traits and capacities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. Okay, we already had that. 2, racial prejudice or discrimination. So now this prejudice aspect has been brought in. That's the major change here from 1977 to 1983. And so here I would say we're really getting into the modern definition. But these are two completely different notions. One is that human behavior is to some extent determined by ancestry groups. And then 2, you just don't like people who are different than you. You don't like people from other groups, other human descent groups. Okay. 2006, this is the last one that we have. 1, a breeding stock of animals. 2, for race, a family, tribe, people, or nation belonging to the same stock. This is the same as 1983. There's no change here. And then for 2006, we have updated racialism to its current definition, the one that we use today, the one that I would prefer to use. They're using it from 1907. They're claiming it from 1907, a theory that race determines human traits and capacities without implying a superiority. And this very much, by 30 years predates that certain political regime, 25, 30 years. Racism, dating to 1933. The advent of a certain political regime, yes? 1, a belief that race is the primary determinant of human traits and capacities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race, racial prejudice, or discrimination. So here we've got, at least finally, a slight separation into racialism as a scientific proposition, and then racism as an attempt to control the discourse, scientific or otherwise, from this 1933 propaganda designed to destroy a particular regime. Okay, so the point of going through this is to try and separate these concepts of common ancestry, shared characteristics, the determination of human behavior based on common descent, and the superiority and world domination doctrine, and subjugating the lesser races as a war propaganda concept, and limitation of scientific discourse idea. And then 5, racial discrimination or prejudice, which is that you're more positively disposed towards people from your group. It's just ethnocentrism, right? So this is hopelessly confused in the popular discourse, and as we move forward, we are going to have to pull apart these different definitions as we deal with this critique that we're doing. So we're just walking through these definitions to show how this stuff changes over time, and if you're not familiar with these different definitions and usages, that's what this is for. Okay? Thank you for your time.